Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport and want to hear from experts from around the world, then subscribe now, because this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Martin Foster, Applied Sport Management Lead at Loughborough University. Today, we're here with Enda King and Al Stewart. Al is Head of Performance Support at Loughborough and leads Strength and Conditioning at the National Tennis Academy. Enda is Head of Performance Rehabilitation with Sports Surgery Clinic in Dublin. Today, we're going to talk about change of direction in injury and performance. We'll hear Enda and Al discuss technical models of excellence and how through testing, monitoring and training, you can create a plan to develop athletes. They explain how all athletes need to be treated as individuals with some practical knowledge of how this can be achieved, even in team sports. Finally, they give us their insights into the reality of getting an athlete back to full fitness. Could you guys just give a brief introduction to yourselves and your background from SSC and rehab? So Al, starting with yourself.
Yep, so I'm Head of Performance Support at Loughborough University at the National Tennis Academy, lead strength and conditioning coach there. Prior to that, my role's progressed really. So prior to that, I was Head of Strength and Conditioning at Loughborough Sport. And then going back prior to that, spent a lot of time working in football, so 12 years. So some time with the FA, with their age group teams. And then 7 years at Man City's Academy and a couple of years each in Championship and Premier League at sort of first team level as well. So
lots of experience, lots in football, but other places as well.
Yeah, lots in football, a little bit of rugby, boxing as well at the moment. So I work with a professional heavyweight boxer at the moment as well. So
lots of experience. So we'll get into that with a change of direction in a moment.
Sure.
And yourself, Edna?
Yeah, I'm Enda King. I'm Head of Performance at the Sports Surgery Clinic in Dublin, which is a private orthopaedic and sports medicine centre. Physiotherapist by trade, but obviously a strong interest in strength and conditioning and biomechanics as part of my role in the clinic, which includes looking after our ACL and groin research programs and looking after our residential rehabilitation program, where athletes come to spend blocks of time for us when they're having chronic overuse injuries or maybe long-term rehabilitation issues.
Perfect. So as I already know, we have so much expertise in the room around agility and change of direction, and I think that might be a good place to kick it off, talking about defining it and then looking at what it actually is and how we work with athletes to develop their change of direction.
Sure. So I think the first thing to note is that often I think the term's used interchangeably, that people talk about agility when they mean change of direction, or change of direction and they mean agility. I think the key difference is that the agility is in response to a stimulus or a number of stimuli. So I think once you get that straight, it makes things much easier from there on in, so you can kind of separate the two things off and say that if it's in reaction to something, there's some kind of cue, whether that's an opponent, a ball, whatever it is, something to react to, that's agility. But if it's just the change of direction, no cues at all, so much like we'll see in sort of some of the testing that I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. I think that's the simple version.
Simple's always good for me, so that's fine. So moving that forward then, so we know what agility is, we know what change of direction is. Why is it important in sport?
I suppose you can probably break it into two aspects of it. I mean, my personal interest or area of exposure comes more in relation to injury, the pathomechanics of injury, and trying to identify movement strategies or competencies either before an athlete becomes injured that might leave them susceptible to, for example, my PhD is in the biomechanics of ACL injury. Almost 50% of ACL injuries in field sports happen during change direction. So how can we analyse how athletes change direction? How can we do that in a closed setting? And then obviously how does that differ from the more chaotic agility driven scenario that Al's just referred to, and then how can we try and intervene around that? And so there are certain areas in terms of monitoring a player's recovery, maybe after surgery or after a particular injury, but also trying to look prospectively at how can we try and keep them healthier and more robust, as opposed to maybe more the performance side of things.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you look into certain sports like football, you've got over 700 changes of direction in a game per player. So when you consider that, it's hugely important. Yeah, it's hugely important. And look, most of those are at shallow angles. Okay, so they're a slight cut or a drift, but it happens a lot. And so it's something that, again, like Enda's referred to, we need to make sure we get a good understanding about the biomechanics of that movement, and the stresses that sort of go along with those movements, but then also putting the right context in place for training so that we can train appropriately, to prepare for those movements, but also not just to reduce risk of injury, but also to improve performance. So.
Okay, so I'm going to take a kind of a back seat, because I love what we have here. We have kind of, from the old school, a physio and an S&C coach. And when I was around S&C back in 2003, it was the physio wrapped them in cotton wool, and the S&C coach wanted to smash them into the ground, and that was the only way. I know things have changed, so it'd be really good for you guys to kind of, for me to sit back and listen to you guys have a conversation of where this goes. So let's start it from, you've got an athlete at 18 years of age, you're trying to develop that athlete and turn them into the product that they have the potential to become, and what would you be doing on that? And then we've got the scenario where they get injured. Then what would you take on there, and how would we then facilitate that back together? Big question.
Yeah, for sure.
Over to you guys.
Yeah. So again, I think you look at the individual, and you build up your picture of them as an athlete, and so you get your starting point. So obviously we've got our technical models that we want to try and work towards, but at some point it's a case of looking at where they're at and what direction we need to take. So the analogy I like to use is that we're trying to direct everybody to the town square, but some people live to the east and some to the west, and so the directions are completely the opposite for those two people, and those could be two athletes. It could be an understrider and an overstrider, and it's not that you speak to athletics coaches, they say we need to shorten the stride slightly, because in athletics it's all about that stride length. But if you talk to team sport athletes, and certainly coaches that work with them, in terms of speed, it's about lengthening that stride, because they take too many steps. And so I think once you know where your athlete is to start and you have your technical model, I think that you can start to build a sort of a path, if you like, for their development. And again, if you have almost a deterministic model for change of direction and agility, and you know the component parts of that, you can start to identify through your testing, through your tracking and your training, you identify where people need support, for example. So if it is that they're lacking in eccentric strength, so we might be able to see that from counter movement jump data from force plate. We might just be able to see it with the eye during training, during gym sessions. It could be a number of different ways we get that information, and then it's identifying as well why we see what we see. So is it that they can't do it? Is it a physical capacity thing? They don't know how to do it? Is it a skill thing, or they don't want to do it? And once we identify that, again, that gives us our direction a little bit in terms of where we head with them. So ideally it's just, if it's a purely physical thing, or they don't know, that's quite simple. So we can put things in place. We can start to put exercises into warm-ups so that we get enough exposure to the right techniques. So we can incorporate movements, whether it's again hop and holds, to develop that eccentric capability and control and coordination. Those kind of things can go into warm-up sessions. We can do specific speed, agility, and change of direction sessions again. And we can kind of put all that together. Again, it's completely individual, based on the athlete and the team and the environment that you're working in. Depends how much time you have available, and whether you have one on their own or whether you have a 25 in a squad.
I was going to ask that actually. So with a squad, you'd be throwing something generic out there that might hit the percentage of X amount of angles that you're going to do in your session, and you know how many they're going to do.
Yeah.
And then potentially, would you then take that individual athlete aside, or pull them out of different drills if required?
Well, I think if you're clever about it, you can individualize within your group session as well. So through your testing, you can identify who has good change of direction capabilities. So they've got good eccentric strength, they coordinate the movement well, their centre of mass over their base of support, they have good control of that. And through the testing, you can almost identify through that how fast somebody is, how well they decelerate. So if we start to look at tests like quite a simple test like a modified 505, so it's 5 meters there and back, one change of direction. You test both feet, you test both starting feet as well, because that's important over 5 meters, because if you always start with the left foot, that might time you nicely into a left foot turn. But if you want to test somebody's right foot, they might have to put an extra step in, and then suddenly you get a score that doesn't quite fit with how capable they are. But if you make them start with the other foot forward, often that corrects it. So when you have all this data, you can almost identify and say, okay, we've got those that need more distance to get to a speed that will challenge their change of direction. So in a squad, for example, you could have 3 groups. You could have those that need a longer distance to accelerate, so you might give them 15 metres to accelerate. So let's take a scenario where we've got 30 players. We could have 10 of them that have 15 metres of acceleration into a change of direction, and then 5 metres, so they're running 20 total. We have that moderate group, the medium group, that are okay, and they have 10 metres in, 10 metres out, 20 metres total. And then you could have your group that generate high velocities, good accelerators. They might only need 5 metres in, 15 metres out. So in that group setting, everybody runs 20, everybody finishes on the line, so it's a race, so it's competitive, and it just ticks that box in terms of giving that stimulus at the right level in that group setting. If you've got an individual, obviously you can be a bit more bespoke, but in that group setting, obviously there's a bandwidth to some of that stuff, so you can't just that's not going to work perfectly for everybody, but it's probably better than everybody running the same distance in and out to the mannequin or around the pole, whatever it might be. I think you can still individualise slightly in those group environments.
That's a nice example of how you'd work that. What about with the injured athlete? Just jumping forward, and then we'll come back to some of the others. So with the injured athlete, where are you starting with your assessments for an injured athlete, and how does that transition back to the SMC go?
Yeah, I think as Al very nicely highlighted, there's a number of factors that influence someone's ability to change direction, external, never mind the stimulus that they're responding to. And some of the challenges in a rehabilitation setting are, how good is good enough? You take the likes of someone with athletic groin pain, so they might have what we call a suboptimal strategy, trunk side flexion, etc. But they might have quite a low training load, so they may never become symptomatic, versus someone who has a relatively good strategy, relatively neutral position, a lot of the core competencies we would look for, but they would have an extremely high training load or extremely high change in load from maybe a young athlete moving into the senior ranks. And so the mechanics in that is kind of an overuse injury. It's more about your room for error. There's no such thing as perfect. There's how much wiggle room can we give them to cope and absorb and transmit the forces that they're doing. Similarly, they might have developed changes in hip morphology, like ephemeral acetabular impingement, which again doesn't mean they're going to have issues, but it may give them less room for error before they begin to impinge their hip joint. There, again, the mechanics begins to influence those things. So part of that individuality is obviously the nature of the injury and how they're responding to rehabilitation, but also what do we measure. So in the clinic in Dublin, we try and use biomechanics to complement the performance side of things, but we know that change direction time is not necessarily a good indicator of symmetry, and change direction time is not a good indicator of symmetry of execution of the task. So again, depending on the demands of how fast they run in and what distance we lead in, but also that the various angles, you can get relatively symmetrical or optimal performance times, but the test can be executed quite differently, and that, I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it may include some risk factors that may predispose them to injury again going forward. And so we look at the performance times, and they've gone back to what were either their previous normal best or recovery of symmetry with that, but they're executing that task with very, very different strategies, which may have obviously injury deficits, but also maybe then from a performance point of view limit the options they have when they go into those chaotic environments going forward. So it's trying to balance that element of the main outcome, which is the speed at which you do it, but we were talking about earlier on about how various options around getting around that, but also the strategy that they executed with that, and where that load is going to be dissipated either acutely, let's say in an ACL injury, or chronically to the anterior hip and pelvis over time, and then going back to try and identify, well, okay, that's the strategy they're choosing. Why are they choosing that? Where are their specific motor controls or strength or power deficits, or is it a coordination issue and it's an old ankle sprain? They just have adapted that way and can be very agile, can be performing at the highest level, but are getting away with it, or at least until they don't get away with it, either acutely or chronically.
What are those examples that you could give then from somebody coming from an ACL injury, and then on the old stopwatch, old school here, they can now run just as quick as they could before. They're ready to play, because actually they're doing something different. What are those things that they're doing differently to make that happen, and how does that make them potentially more susceptible to an injury? Yeah, there's
probably three main ways. Number one, a lot of the ACL struggle to regain extensor capacity, so struggle to regain quad strength, struggle to regain that plyometric and reactive ability. And what that often means is when they enter into a change direction, that they'll they'll bluff or cheat, they'll decelerate more with the penultimate step to try and combat that. But when they're in a chaotic environment, they won't have that choice, because it may be a sidestep to be offensive or defensive. So that if you want to call it, that deficit is hidden in the test, but then is exposed brutally in a performance or in an injury point of view. They'll also then, again, you see someone who doesn't want to land or doesn't have the capacity, then they land in quite an extended knee position or landed quite rigidly, but obviously that's going to create much higher forces through the joint itself and through the patellofemoral joint. And so again, these are the athletes that tend to change direction. A more rigid extended knee, they almost vault to change direction, and obviously in the short and long term that may have consequences with how they load their knee acutely and chronically. So again, it's coming back to those base physical competencies, but a lot of time those athletes can redevelop those strengths, but not redevelop the pattern of coordination, or maybe that coordination, maybe that's what got them in trouble in the first place, and it's lingered around ever since.
Yeah, because I know there's someone like Carl Wells at Sheffield United at the moment. When he was at St George's Park with Spire there, he did a lot of work in looking at force plate data, looking at time in eccentric phase, people recovering from ACL. So just one way to kind of really hone in on, right, let's actually have a look at the quality of that movement. And so they were getting back to a 50 centimetre counter movement jump, which is what they'd done pre-injury, which is great, because now it's like, right, we'll chuck them back in, you can go and train. But actually the way that they did that and achieved that on the affected limb was that they spent longer in that side, and they just found a way. Again, the athletes find a way. You know, the line of least resistance, just if that's hurting, I'll avoid it, and something else will take over, and it ends up then, that's where you maybe pick up some of your secondary injuries and things like that, and you put yourself at risk in that way. So it's so there are other ways to try and identify some of these things, but I think they're definitely things that we're both targeting in that early stage of rehab. You know, in terms of muscle quality and function, and again looking at that more closed environment, certainly in the early stage. And as Enda said earlier, it's to do with that predictability of movement. If it's predictable, you can share out the steps. You know you're changing direction on that pole, mannequin, cone, whatever it is. It's static. So 10 steps out, you start to adjust your movement, you start to adjust your centre of mass, your patterning of your footwork. But if that were to be a moving person, suddenly you might just have to jam that foot into the floor to track their movement, for example. Or even as an attacking player, if a defender shows you one way, you may jam your foot in and say there's an opportunity to get into an area of danger here to receive a ball or whatever it is. So it's so I think the next step is how we introduce some of those, if we call them affordances, if you like. So those cues, so it could be the opposition, it could be the ball, it could be your own pace, and you take all that into account. And it's, again, if you think a player with an ACL, it's months that they're having out, it's not weeks, and it's months away from that chaotic environment where they lose some of that anticipation, avoidance. That's the thing that really is, when you speak to players when they go back in for the first time, they always comment how busy it is and like how much is going on, and they just got dizzy because it was all, you know, in a little possession game when they first go back in. So it's how you start to incorporate elements of cue recognition and scanning and decision making, again based on some of those affordances. So how quick am I? How quick's the guy I'm playing against? The pitch is wet, so the ball's going to run faster. The pitch is dry, so it's going to hold up. It's windy, so that ball's going to hold, so I need to keep running. And those kind of, taking all those things into account, I think you can manipulate training in such a way that you can gradually introduce maybe one thing to start with. It's me and an opponent, it's open space, there's no target area to run to, I just track his movement and I just follow that. So you can start to build in reactivity, and again that's where you move from your change of direction to agility. You can certainly start to incorporate that, and I think that's where the crossover initially occurs between S&C and physio on field. I think nowadays it's, I know you know, when I was in club football, the day that the scan comes in, you're sat with the physio talking about it and talking, actually we just need to limit this range, but anything other than that. And so you put things in place to make sure somebody doesn't hit that, perhaps that angle of knee flexion for particular injuries. But you can, it's more on what you can do than what you can't do, and that relationship, that integrated approach starts from day one. While it might be heavier time with the physio, it's that integrated approach. And then again, as soon as I get back on pitch, it's about making sure that we still target the same things and we keep that pathway of development for that injured athlete to come back, and again introduce some of that some of that affordance perception or perception action coupling. I think there's a load of different terms for it, but essentially what you see and what you know. It could be an affordance could be the score in a game. You could put a little game on and say, okay, you're winning 1-0, you've got the ball in the corner, what are you going to do? Because it's very different to what happens when you're losing 1-0 with the ball in the corner. They're two different things. So, and it's about putting things like that to try and manipulate sort of people's decision making, and adding in more and more sort of variables. So one opponent, two opponents, and field position, two opponents, field position, score. You start to add all these things in, and it starts to get closer to essentially stepping stones back towards full sports performance. I think is the best way to sort of summarise it.
And where does that decision come? I'm the player and I'm hitting my scores as I was before. I want to play.
Decision might be out of your hands. The manager might see you and say, "I've just seen him. I've just seen him sprinting across the pitch. I need him for Saturday."
I think, and it goes back to most injuries or most performance. It's kind of beginning with the end in mind. So if you can kind of talk the player through the curriculum and sort of, okay, we're going to land, we're going to blah 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 blah, and step our way through it, he'll almost be able to tell you, or her will be able to tell you where they are in the curriculum, and where it falls down is because often an ACL is a good example. Injury takes 6, 9, 12 months to recover. I mean, that's a long pre-season. You give any athlete that length of time to take the hand off you. So why is there still physical deficits there that are influencing their ability to participate on the field? Is it because I wasn't systematic enough, or was I not just clear enough with the athlete about all those steps? And am I measuring those things either from a change direction point of view or the base qualities that include that? So you get so many people coming for a review at 9 months, and you kind of go back to play or not come out. Well, I'm not going to make that decision today. That decision was probably made about a month and a half ago in preparation of the angle you're kind of getting ready to come in and play. And so again, the ability to assess what we can assess, but again, trying to give them the vocabulary or the movement capacity to do what they need to do in those chaotic environments. Very often it's, it's this time point, am I ready? Or it's been a 6 weeks for a hamstring, am I ready? That kind of depends where you started from, and it kind of depends on how you stepped your way through it. So I think the rather than it being a day, kind of the more we can blur that in, and I mean, and so much of it is, I mean, the mechanics of good agility or good performance are very similar to the ones that are going to minimise your injury risk per se. So the more we can change the conversation away from rehab and towards performance, maybe the better buy-in we can get. We all know we're great when we're in pain, and we're terrible when we've no pain. So the more we can transition that through to good movement being good movement, potentially the better carryover we'll have.
Yeah, and I think that's a message that needs to be consistent throughout the club. So like you alluded to, it's the agent, it's the manager, it's the coaches, and having that clarity around what stage they're at. And it's, again, I think a good use of language is to talk about performance, and they're at this level of return to performance, not it's rehab. It's about, again, it's just another level of performance that they're at that point in time. And I think if you can shift the sort of the use of language, I think you shift people's expectation a little bit as well in terms of what they see and what might come out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see time and again the kind of ripple of not half-managed injuries, because that's not fair because the injury is healed, but the physical legacy that's left behind after an injury, an old ankle sprain. You see it all the time in rugby, dislocated shoulder, next thing I'm developing groin pain on the contralateral side after it. So my right side's my bad side, that's the side I've got all my injuries on. Yeah. We hear about it all the time, and obviously you've tissue damage. That tissue is going to have maybe a reduced tolerance or change tolerance in the short to medium term, but so much of the time it's the legacy of those movement strategies that either we haven't developed back up the base qualities, or haven't redeveloped the coordination or agility specific to the given sport.
So you talked about the movement pattern of players, and I'm just wondering, players may not be injured, but they may not be moving how they should be moving. So do you have a process there of kind of going, this guy's probably going to get injured if he keeps moving like that, and what do you try and do in that? Is that an on-field thing? Is it an off-field thing? Is it a decision between you to go, he's got potential for an injury with the way he's turning, for example?
There's a classic answer to this one. It depends.
That's always the answer.
It's always the answer. It's always the answer. And there are so many factors it depends on that there are some that absolutely you would need to intervene because the risk is so high, and there are others that have been performing at a level. You could get someone in the mid-30s who's played football and over 700, 800 league games, and they've always moved like that, and in some ways you think, am I going to open a can of worms in trying to alter and change something for somebody, or am I going to give them an extra 2 or 3 years from now if I manage to make a slight adjustment and improve that? And again, it goes back to the reasoning why and your assessment of that is it to do with their hip shape, the fact that they can't get into some of those positions, and actually if we force them into those positions, we're going to start to create inflammation, and then we're going to affect movement quality in other ways, and that has a negative knock on. Or actually it's purely a skill thing. And make no mistake that when you're talking about elite sportsmen, they do pick up new skills and new qualities and new movements really quickly and really well, and if there is an advantage to it, they recognise that, and they'll be all over it and will buy in, to the point that certainly in my experience you almost have to keep the reins on them a little bit, because as soon as they get a feeling that actually you're right, that's a better strategy for completing that task, solving that problem, they almost overdo it. Then it's like, okay, right, that helped me 10% just doing it for an hour, well I'm going to do 10 hours of this, because then I'm 100% better.
And they get overloaded and injured from doing that.
They get overloaded and injured from doing that. So I think it's, again, it depending a lot on the individual and their case, and what are the limitations, and why is it like that again. And I think one of the issues that you have, and it's probably another podcast, but it's that I'm getting picked, I'm getting paid, I'm playing international sport. You really want me to change something I'm doing right now? Yeah, but you might get injured. It's a risk. Or yeah, but you could be better.
Yeah, that's it. And it's always the 28-year-olds to come back and say, geez, if I'd known this 6 or 7 years ago, what difference would it have made? I mean, time and again I'm seeing the broken ones, so it's not the healthy ones, but it's yeah, I mean, as you said earlier on, I mean, ultimately we don't know what perfect movement is, because in reality there is no such thing as perfect. It's ultimately the load that exposes. So again, you're talking about how good is good movement or not. Well, it kind of depends on their training frequency, everything else, and often you find a moving club, if you're doing the clop press, it might be more demanding than if you're doing something else, but that feeds back into the technical and tactical demands of the coach and what they're doing. So again, it's so multifaceted. Again, this what it comes back to, just being able to, if you're on a journey in a club for a number of years, that there's a curriculum, and you're every year you're moving a little bit better, whatever the hell that means. But you begin to tick more boxes and give yourself again more room for error, rather than what we always see is that it's when the injury rears its head that's where and I don't think they need to do any more. I find having a biomechanics lab in the clinic is fantastic and terrible at the same time, because if you're retesting someone at 9 months after 6 months, you'd want to be bloody sure their movement has changed quite considerably. So it's a phenomenal mirror to, is what I'm doing actually making any difference? I can do change direction drills, I can do jumping and landing drills, but actually are the physical qualities changing, and are the movement strategies changing? And so you can do a lot of stuff and change nothing at the same time.
I think the thing to bear in mind as well is that if you're talking about getting people like back to baseline, again, you start with the end point in mind. We want to get you back to where you were got you injured often. So, and if you look at sports like football, certainly in terms of the physical capacities, I think there's some research came out maybe 6 years ago now, Chris Barnes, looking at some of the Prozone data, where over an 8-year period from 2005 they showed an 84% increase in the number of sprints per team. Like, that's significant, especially when you think back to watching football back then. You think an 84% increase, and that's again just anecdotally from my own experience, seeing some of that data season on season, that looks to have continued, that just over 10% a year, that certainly looks to have continued. And again, if you've got somebody out for 9 to 12 months, you've got to look at actually, what am I putting them back in? I'm not putting them back into the last game that they played before they got injured. I'm putting them into another level again. And like Enda said, if you're going to play for Jurgen Klopp and you're going to have that hard high press that require high levels of acceleration, but then you've got to have really good deceleration qualities. I guess it's the analogy I quite like is that it's like having a Ferrari with a Fiesta's brakes. You're not going to drive it that fast because it's going to crash. You're going to have a bump. Something's going to break. And it's the same with athletes. You can have all the acceleration capacity, but if you can't stop, you're not going to use that. And if you try to, it's going to end in either injury or yourself or somebody else. And I think you see that a little bit with some teams that don't play like that particularly, but have to play like that in certain games. And you can go back to Chelsea Barcelona from a few years ago, I think it might have been, and Chelsea needed a result, and so they had to press. but weren't used to it. And so you've got players that are running past the ball, past the man with the ball, into the man with the ball, just because they weren't used to a high velocity, high intensity press. That takes some time to adapt to and to learn, not just the skill of it, but to develop the physical capacity to be able to sprint up to 8-9 meters per second and then get down to 0 and stand somebody up and force them into a decision either way, and not just have to get off your feet and slide, or to run past them, or to foul them, or something like that. So I think again, with the end point in mind, it goes back to the coach, the manager. What are the demands of the manager and the sport? And again, when you put all that together, that gives you your direction for everybody, that for where they need to get to. And I think it's always worth adding 10 to 20% on top.
Absolutely.
Give yourself a buffer, give yourself the bandwidth to be able to cope, that if things do progress, if a new manager does come in and asks for more. And I think still with certain sports, I don't think we're anywhere near physical capacity within certain sports. And again, I think when you look across, even within Europe, into some of the physical stats coming out of some of the other European leagues are still higher than the Premier League. While the quality might not be there, they're showing that physically people are capable, players are capable of many more high intensity runs, sprints over 7 meters per second in matches, which is the general metric that we'll use. And again, I think it opens up, and again, that crosses over into a number of other sports as well, where perhaps they don't have some of that physical data, some of those objective markers at the moment. I guess in sports like tennis, the one I've gone into, that they're just sort of scratching the surface with some of that data at the moment. So
and just an interesting point on metrics, so many of our performance metrics in the gym are concentric based. It's how high you can jump, it's whatever else. But from an injury point of view, a performance point of view, I mean, the one that can slow down the quickest is the one that can go again, and is least likely to get injured. So I mean, so much of, and again, the proliferation of force plates, it's our ability to analyse these things and influence and assess what we're doing has changed all the time. But they're again, I'm biased by working with more injured populations, but there's always an imbalance with their ability to control the forces they can produce, and it has a knock-on effect to the Ferrari engine and the Fiesta brakes. Is it's good for business. It certainly, it creates a lot more issues.
I'm a huge fan of Al's analogies. He's dropped a couple in there, and I like.
I've stolen two already. It's been recorded.
Yeah. We'll have a listen again. So, I mean, we've gone through a lot of different kind of angles with this change of direction and agility. So I'm going to put you kind of both on the spot a little bit. Just to kind of sum up, in terms of change of direction, what are we talking about as a summary? What do we do as an S&C coach, as a physio, to enhance someone's change of direction and to bring somebody back from rehabilitation, like a 1 minute summary of what you would do? And I know it depends and it's individual, but what's the process?
Well, I think the common mistakes are focusing only on the performance outcomes, so looking only at time, and not appreciating how the test you select influences the time you calculate. And like all these things, it's not only what I produce, but it's how I produce it. And then understanding the limitations of what we can test reliably and reproducibly, and how that translates into chaotic sporting environments, and what we can change in the gym and on the training field versus what we can change in the practice field, and how that translates into sports. I think from an injury point of view anyway, they're the two big things, that you're not constraining it enough to look at how they're moving and how they're executing it, allowing them to bluff, so to speak, but the numbers are going back up, but then also not maybe bridging that gap back to the agility and the sport specific stimulus.
I think if we can look at those component parts, like Enda says, if we get a good idea about what makes up that performance, so what makes up that fast time in and out, is it just, you could have two players, one's a really good accelerator, poor at decel, one's poor at accel, great at decel. They both come out of that change of direction test with exactly the same time, and you go, okay, what are we giving each of these players to develop their change of direction capability? It's two completely different things. One needs more accel, so needs to hold higher speed, or needs to be able to generate higher speed, and the other one needs more eccentric capability, and it needs to be about stopping. It needs to improve their brakes. And so I think if we can come up with tests that identify that, so whether we use, I know Sophia Nymphius did a lot of work on the modified 505 using a differential. So if you know somebody's speed, you can take out 10 meters of their running, if you like. So I'm a I'm a 1 second 5 metre runner. It takes me 1 second to cover 5 metres. So in that test where I cover 10, I take 2 seconds out of my score. Whatever's left is my differential. So that's the deceleration, the stop if you like, and the reacceleration. That's the bit that's left over. So I think that is another level of detail that helps us. And I think if you can then start to take the speed as well, and you can almost divide that differential by the speed, you can come up with it generates an arbitrary number, but it crosses over the slower athlete that has the better differential than the faster athlete. But they're similar, but actually it's still better that the faster athlete, because he's getting in and out quicker. And we go back to performance again, and the things it stacks up to, that's still a better performance. But it gives us a bit more information on how we prescribe training for each individual. And I think once we know that, we've got to know where they are and then where we want to get them to. And once we know that, then
they're on the right path.
We're on the right path, certainly.
Right,
yeah, definitely.
Well, guys, it's absolutely brilliant conversation, and I hope our listeners really get a lot from it. I'm sure they will. Moving forward, me and Al are certainly going to be doing some more podcasts and maybe touching on some of the things we've talked about there. So we've mentioned training load, we've mentioned strength training, we mentioned on and off field kind of things going on, we've mentioned the movement mechanics, and if you are available, we'd love to get you back on again for a future podcast. So thanks for your time today. We can all go back to the Performance Symposium and go and eat some lunch and things a little bit slower than we did a minute ago. But yeah, really appreciate you coming in, and thanks a lot. Thanks, Al and Enda. What a great example of how physios and strength and conditioning coaches need to have excellent relationships to ensure the best development of athletes. In future podcasts, we'll be hearing more from Al and coaches from around the country, where we'll focus on all aspects of strength and conditioning. If you want to get in touch and let us know any subject areas or experts that you'd be keen to listen to, then contact me, Martin Foster, on m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk or tweet me at martinfoster82. Bye for now, we'll see you next time.